One of the things that has consistently astounded me is that on opportunities you have to meet people who have achieved some level of greatness in their life, it is generally the case that people who have achieved greatness will have a fair dose of humility about themselves. They might just tell you, hey, I'm just like anyone else, but here's this one thing I persisted in. Here's this one thing I happen to be blessed with. But most people who achieve greatness have some sense of their own shortcomings, and just as they could boast of their accomplishments, they would just as easily talk about some of the things that were difficult for them on the path to where they've arrived. There's a quote that I love from Michael Jordan, for example. You think about all that he achieved, all the reputation that he still has many years after his retirement in basketball. But I've always loved this quote from him. He said, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." It's failures, it's trying over and over and over again, he says, that ultimately for him led to greatness. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is another prime example of someone we would all point to. It doesn't take long if you try to make a list of the most significant American presidents. He's usually in the top 2, isn't he? Great significance in what he did in his life. But yet it's well known how many failures he experienced along the way to the things he accomplished. Tons of failures, tons of defeats. He went through the experience of getting fired and losing a job. He was defeated for at least 6 different positions that he was running for government. He had a business he ran that failed and had to close. One point in his life, he experienced a significant nervous breakdown. In fact, one of the things that I appreciate about Abraham Lincoln most is not just that he failed and got up and tried again, but this is a person who we're pretty sure at this point experienced significant clinical depression for much of his life. In fact, as we read stories about his parents, it seems that both of his parents also struggled greatly with depression. We don't know exactly the genetic link of depression, but it does seem that there is some sort of correlation between people who experience depression and often their children experiencing the same thing. But he really battled with this. Even in the 1860 Republican convention in Illinois, one of the observers there described Lincoln as one of the worst plagued men he had ever seen. Man, this guy's really got some stuff that he's battling. His friends would talk about what they called his melancholy. He's even known to have spoken about suicide on a few different occasions. This is a man who really battled a lot with his inner demons. One of the things that I've appreciated about him is that even as he was up against depression, which is not just a simple thing to get over, if you battle with depression, it doesn't help at all when someone says, well, why don't you cheer up? I mean, if you could, you would. This is a difficult thing when you experience it. But when he spoke of his own melancholy, as he called it, he says, it is a misfortune, not a fault. It's a misfortune. This is something that I battle with. This is something that for whatever reason I really struggle with. It is a misfortune. It is not a fault. It's not another reason for me to have yet another guilt trip about the fact that something seems to be wrong with me. No, this is an unfortunate thing, but it's also something that I'm going to have to work through. Part of how Lincoln faced his challenges was in trying to find things that were of good purpose. He decided that even if he couldn't feel great about all parts of his life, he was going to do things with his life that he could feel good about, things that he could feel proud about. And along the way, he developed some great characteristics. He's known for having a wonderful sense of humor. He was a witty person. His battles with depression allowed him to also remain a fairly humble person. He always was well aware of his shortcomings. Ultimately, he also allowed these struggles to drive him to deeper faith in God, trusting that even though his emotions weren't always intact, that God could still do things through him, significant things that mattered. So I have no idea about most of you, whatever it is you're going through right now, that somehow makes you feel less than. Maybe there's something in your life right now that you struggle with and you say, if it only weren't for that one thing holds me back so much. It makes me less sure of myself. It makes me afraid to try. It makes me feel unworthy. Joe talked about some of these things in his devotional before communion. We all have something. I believe every person has some kind of an inner struggle that very quietly we all go through. And so this morning, being aware of that, I wanted us to look at a person in Scripture that I find to be really inspirational, someone who really had significant struggles, significant setbacks. His name was Bartimaeus. We find his story in Mark chapter 10. This man is a blind beggar, significant limitations. And whether this was just some sort of an accident that led to his blindness, whether it was something that he was born with, we don't really know why he was blind, but we do know that this is a person of no social standing in society. All he could do was sit there and hope that people would provide him with sustenance, because there was very little that he could do. There was little opportunity for him in life. So the story reads in Mark chapter 10 and verse 46. It says, "Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, 'Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.' Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' So they called to the blind man, 'Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you.' Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. 'What do you want me to do for you?' Jesus asked him. The blind man said, 'Rabbi, I want to see.' 'Go,' said Jesus, 'your faith has healed you.' Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road." I wonder what the rest of that crowd, it mentions that Jesus had a crowd with him as he was traveling. I really wonder what the rest of that crowd would have thought about Bartimaeus. I'm sure in a crowd that big there'd be a lot of different thoughts on him, if they thought about him at all. Don't you assume there'd be a few people who'd tell you it was probably deserved. Whatever his condition was, there's probably something about him that made him deserve to experience what he was experiencing. There must be some reason why he's just a blind beggar on the side of the road. There's probably some reason that God is allowing this to happen to him. Maybe they thought he was deserving of it. Maybe in some way they thought better of themselves because they weren't in the same boat. Well, he's a blind guy, but because I can see, because I can be a more productive member of society, maybe God favors me more than God favors him, because look at his condition, look at his situation. But the one thing that everyone knew in this circumstance was that this blind beggar started shouting. Regardless of how he got to be blind, regardless of what circumstances brought Jesus along his path, when he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was nearby, this is a guy that simply began shouting. I imagine he didn't even know what direction he was supposed to shout. He just started shouting so that anyone who could hear him would hear him. So I don't know what your personal issue is. I don't know what your personal setback is. But I do believe that Bartimaeus provides us with a healthy example of having boldness in how we approach God. Boldness to me is the word that really comes through when I think of Bartimaeus. Boldness is difficult, isn't it? We don't want to put ourselves out there. Maybe we worry that if I try to ask God for something boldly, if I really just lay it out there for God and say what it is that I'm wanting, maybe He'll tell me no. Maybe He won't give me the thing that I'm wanting, or maybe it just feels like He never answers me at all. But boldness can be a very vulnerable thing. I mean, in that moment, can't you just see the vulnerability? A blind man just shouting while everyone else is telling him to be quiet? But that boldness is something that Jesus takes note of. And despite any doubts that he had, what if I fail? What if I say it the wrong way? What if he doesn't answer me? He was simply going to move forward and do what he could. And so I want to reflect on Bartimaeus as a good example of boldness this morning. And I'm just going to make a few observations about this story. I think an important thing for each of us to understand is that fundamentally, no matter what it is you'd like to think about yourself, all of us are blind beggars, are we not? That's really what we are. And I'm not just talking about, your physical sight. All of us experience significant limitations. I can't see the future, can you? I mean, even the weathermen on TV whose job it is to predict the weather, so often it's difficult to know what's the weather even going to do tomorrow or next week or in a couple of weeks. We can't predict the future. I can't see that far into the distance and know all the things I'm doing right now, exactly where are all these things going to lead. It's not possible to know a lot of those things. In fact, I'm often blind towards the circumstances I'm actually in, aren't you? I don't see all the factors going on here. I have certain things I think are happening, but then I might gain new information and say, wow, I was just totally misreading that situation. I was totally misunderstanding that person. I'm not only blind toward the future, I'm often blind towards the very situations that I'm in. I just don't see all the things going on the way that I wish I could. And beyond that, aren't we all limited in what we could do? I mean, you don't have to start dreaming very much to start dreaming outside of what your limitations will allow. I've only got so many resources. I only have so much talent. I only have so much time. There's great limitations that we all experience in terms of what we can see and what it is that we're capable of. So looking at a man who is a blind beggar is informative for all of us. We all experience a great amount of short-sightedness and not the capability to do everything that we wish we could do. I think a great irony of this story is, of course, that of all the people present, it's the blind man who sees most clearly, isn't it? This is the one man who knows what he doesn't know. He knows who he is and what he is, and he knows how dearly he needs God's help in his life, in his situation. We want to hang on to this delusion that somehow we could just do this on our own, or if I just tried a little harder, or if I stayed up a few hours later or got up a few hours earlier, somehow I could be self-sufficient. Here's a guy who has no such delusions about himself. This is who I am, and unless Jesus helps me, I'll never do any of the things that I'm really capable of with his help. Great irony is seeing the blind man who could see better than everyone else could. We can't see much. We don't know much. We don't really have much. But what we do have all comes from God. We are merely blind beggars. I'm also challenged from his example of the importance of asking God for what it is that we need. I think he's such a striking figure because of all the things he experienced in his life that were shortcomings. The one thing that Bartimaeus was not going to live with was regret for what he didn't do. Here's a man who saw an opportunity. He saw that there might be help, and irrespective of how Jesus was going to respond to him, here's a man who was going to be able to say, you know, he may have said no to me, he may have ignored me, but I at least made the effort to ask for it. I asked him for it. I told Jesus what I needed. I reached out, I made myself vulnerable, and I found out Jesus was nearby, and I said, Jesus, if you're there, help me. Help me. The titles that he uses for Jesus are actually fairly significant. When Jesus is walking by, it mentions Jesus of Nazareth, it's kind of the name he was known by, but you notice when he addresses Jesus, he calls him the Son of David. The Son of David, he's invoking this promise from generations back that if this really is the descendant of David, that God is with him. I trust that this is a significant person. He addresses him as the Son of David, reminding God of God's promises. You know, the whole reason that this line has stayed intact is that you've promised you're going to send this servant who's going to help us. He invokes the promises of God even as he makes this request. And then when he addresses Jesus directly, he calls him Rabbi, teacher. He takes this posture of humility that I'm the one who needs to give you a title. I'm the one who needs to rely on you and show respect for you. So if you're willing to give me something, I'm here to receive it. If you're willing to teach me something, I'm here to learn. This is a man, again, ironically, with blind eyes, who has eyes to see and ears to hear, does he not? This is a man open and receptive to whatever it is that God is going to give him. You know, James also talks about the importance of being bold in how we approach God, being bold in what we ask of from God. In James chapter 4 and verse 1, he says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." That's one of those scriptures that stings a lot, doesn't it? That's a hard passage. To begin with, you don't have because you don't ask. If you want something from God, if you want God's help, how much time are you setting aside to actually talk to God about what's happening in your life? How much are you taking time to seek God's wisdom on your situation, to ask God for the wisdom that you need, the help that you need, the provisions that are necessary for what you want? But isn't he perceptive about the problem with our inner battles? Isn't it always the petty stuff that we fight about the most? I know the vast majority of arguments I can think of I've ever been in my life. There are very few things I can remember where I've been in conflict with someone and it was over something important enough to remember this far down the road. Isn't it most of the time just the stupid stuff we get caught up in, all tied into our ego and our status, and they didn't do this and I wanted them to do this and I want everyone in the world to fit my view of what the world ought to be. And we can get so bogged down with this stuff that we have these conflicts. And James says, you get bogged down in this stuff, but a lot of the things in your life you don't have because you're simply not making the time to ask the one who really can give them to you. But then he says, as you ask God for things in your life, you need to be asking yourself from your request, well, what about my request? Like, what's in it for God? This thing I tell God that I want, this new opportunity, God, I want you to bless me with this new path, this new career, this new friendship, this new relationship, whatever it is you're asking God for, what's in it for God? Are you thinking about God's purposes, or are you merely just looking for more things to feed into your ego problems and your addiction to approval or whatever it is that drives you? What is really in it for God in the things you're trying to accomplish in your life? But the reverse implication of this text is, when you're really dedicating yourself to God's purposes and you seek help from God to accomplish the things that are God's will, God absolutely will come through and help us. That He will hear our requests, that we should be bold in saying to God, here's the thing you promised, here are the things you said you would do, and so now, God, I remind you of what you promised, and I ask you to be faithful to your promise. I'll try to be courageous, but I need you to help me because I'm not that smart and I'm not that brave. Help me, God. We should ask God for what we need. In this story, I'm also reminded that when you show greater faith in your life, when you start stepping out on faith and trying to grow your faith, isn't it so often the case that greater faith is met with greater opposition? What a sad aspect of this story that as this man starts shouting, here is a man who is reaching out for God's help, and how many people in this story tell him to stop reaching? Do you see that in that story? He starts reaching out, and then there's all these voices that say, oh, why don't you just shut up? He's trying to talk. He's trying to teach the rest of us. We can't hear because you won't shut your mouth. He's got all these people wanting him to dial back and to stop doing the things that he's doing. He's reaching out on faith, and they say, stop reaching. So one of the struggles with growing in our faith, one of the problems in being a faithful person is that as you try to get more faithful, there absolutely will be those voices in your life from people who tell you to dial it back and knock it off. Isn't that the case? I wish it were always the case that when you try to be a better person, everyone else is inspired by that and wants to be a better person. And I believe much of the time that does happen, whether you know it or not, that people see your example, and when you show greater courage and greater faith, and they see your faith rewarded, they will see you and they want to be like you. But a lot of times people's gut reaction is, when someone is just showing this unusual dedication to God, the first thing you want to say is, oh, knock it off. Why is that? It's because when you're shining your light more brightly, it just reminds me that I'm not shining mine so brightly. A lot of times when people see your example of greater faith, it reminds them that you're showing courage where they have showed cowardice, that you're reaching out for God's promises when they have refrained from doing that. A lot of people are going to settle for the status quo in your life. And even though they might think they're okay for now, further down the road, people end up with these regrets. I really wish I would have. I wonder what would have happened if I did. I should have just tried a little more. I probably could have done more. See, those are words that Bartimaeus was not going to have to say, was he? Here's the man who did the thing that he knew he could. And I want to encourage you to be that same person, to do the things that you know you can, to make yourself vulnerable for God, to try and show greater faith, fully expecting that those people who often want to do nothing might be a voice of discouragement toward you. There's a story I love about D.L. Moody. He's a very famous preacher from the 1900s, and he was known for being a person who was evangelistic. He reached a lot of people with the gospel, and there was this one lady who approached him on an occasion to critique him. This lady pulled him aside and said, Mr. Moody, I want you to know I have some real problems with the way that you do evangelism. The methods for how you communicate the gospel, the way that you talk to people, your plan for how you work them through it, there's certain aspects of the way that you're reaching out that I don't like. And he said, well, you know what? I don't like everything about my methods either. Sometimes I wish I were wiser. I wish I had better methods. So he said, okay, so there are some problems with how I'm doing it. So how do you do it? And she kind of looked at him and said, well, I don't do it. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I like my method of how I do it better than your method of how you don't do it. Right? Better to have a flawed method, better to make some mistakes, better to be a little sloppy and to keep moving in the direction of faithfulness than to say, because I can't be perfect or because I don't like any approach completely that I see, I'm just going to pull back and not do anything. But there are going to be many people in your lives who see your greater faithfulness and they'd love to be your critic. But if you're going to accept criticism from someone, you should also examine the fruit of their life and see what fruit is God producing through them. Do they actually demonstrate wisdom and faithfulness and love and mercy in such a way that you could learn from it? Or are these just people wanting to excuse their own laziness? You need to be careful whose criticism you're willing to receive. Another thing I would encourage you to remember is that, in your life, if anyone ever criticizes you for greater dedication or for doing something good, one thing that means about you is that you matter. We don't criticize people who don't matter to us. We don't criticize the people that we never think about who aren't making any kind of difference. If you get criticism in your life, even though criticism is painful and it's not fun to receive, the fact that someone is criticizing you means that in their worldview, you're a key player in something. Criticism means you're making a difference. So don't immediately just draw back because someone has said something harsh or has critiqued something that you've tried to do. Greater faith is met with greater opposition. Expect it, be prepared for it, but persevere through it, and don't stop shouting and asking and knocking. I'm also reminded by this story that if we live by faith, we get to experience the blessings of faith. There are some of these that I'm convinced come immediately. Doesn't it just feel good when you've really tried hard one day to wake up well and you made time to pray and you looked at Scripture and maybe you said a few things to a person that you've been trying to get the courage to say, or you stopped and you did something kind and generous for someone? There's immediate benefit to that, isn't there? Don't you just feel a little bit better about your day when you did something? There are some ways that faithfulness is like a light switch where it gives you some immediate forms of blessing, but I also believe that some of the greater blessings of a life of faith are ones we don't see for a very long time. Where you planted some seeds of kindness and you never thought they'd become something, but later down the road you might learn that you changed a person's life who went on to change several other people's lives. The blessings of faithfulness are often not ones that we can see immediately, but when we live by faith, we get to experience the blessings of faith. Bartimaeus didn't know that morning was going to be the day that he received his sight. He didn't know that he was ever going to receive his sight, but he was faithful, he asked, he was bold, and then one day he got a wonderful blessing of healing in his life. I was thinking about the importance of faithfulness, and I was reminded of this passage in Habakkuk that also gets quoted a few times in the New Testament. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 3 says, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness." It's a mature perspective on how God works. God's given his promises. They're going to come in his time, and his timing will be perfect. And sometimes it's hard for us to wait on him. You can't always see exactly when it's coming or exactly when God will act, but when he acts, you'll know it would have been the right time. Wait for it. Trust in it. Because God is coming. It won't be false. But those of us who live by faithfulness, we get to experience the blessings of faithfulness. Bartimaeus had some people in his life who were discouraging voices, didn't he? When he started reaching out, he had a bunch of the crowd who said, "Oh, just be quiet and draw back and stop asking." But then he also had people who got to be that voice of encouragement. And I'd like to think that we all have those as well. You've got some voices that would discourage you, but I hope we've all got some voices of encouragement. And so I wanted you this morning to have ears to hear this word of encouragement that Bartimaeus received, and I hope you'll listen to this as if it were a word for you. These words were, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." That's what they said to Bartimaeus. Jesus reached out to him and they said, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." Take heart. Don't stay in despair. It's okay to be discouraged. It's okay to worry. It's okay to be sad sometimes, but don't stay in that place. Take heart. Don't think your life is over just because you made one bad mistake or you had one significant failure or embarrassment. Your life's not over until God says it's over. And God does all kinds of amazing things through flawed people. Take heart. Take heart. Don't get too discouraged. Get up. If you've been knocked down, then get up. Try again. Don't stop trying. Bartimaeus was healed because when his opportunity came, he did stand up and accept that opportunity. Take heart and get up. And the reason that you should do either of these things is because Jesus is calling us. This is the reason we should take heart, because Jesus, in his life, in his death, in his resurrection, calls and invites us into the family of God and into the purposes of God, into something much greater than any of us could ever be on our own. He invites us into these things. He's calling us to these things. God invites us. He calls us. God remembers you. God sees you. God hears you when you pray to him. He's calling you. Reflecting on this passage, I came across a story that I find helpful. Carolina snapped this picture a few months ago at the Botanical Gardens. What I love about it is she found this cocoon. It was on a plant we were looking at, and we kind of spun it around. And there was this beautifully formed cocoon on the side of it. But I love that you can see it's a cocoon, but you can also see the wings are pretty well fully formed inside that cocoon, just getting ready to come out. There's a story about a young boy who found a cocoon much like this one, and he saw that on the back of the cocoon there was a gap. And what was happening was the butterfly was ready to come out, and it was struggling to come out. Again and again and again, it would strive to get out. It would try to squeeze through the opening and force the cocoon back open, but it was just so difficult. And he thought to himself, why, I hate to see a butterfly struggle like that. So he pulled out a little pocket knife, and he made an extra cut in that cocoon so that the butterfly could get out much more easily. And so, of course, very quickly then, the butterfly came the rest of the way out, but its wings stayed drooping. It could only walk. It couldn't extend its wings. And in fact, that butterfly didn't live very long because it had no ability to fly. Because as it turns out, the butterfly needs the experience of moving through that difficult, tiny opening in the cocoon because there are important fluids in its body that therefore get squeezed and forced into the wings. And its wings are healthy as it goes through that process of being squeezed and being challenged. A butterfly needs to exit that cocoon in a difficult way so that it can therefore be healthy enough to fly and have a good life. That's true for us too. We need to have difficulties. We need to have setbacks. We don't need to always avoid things that challenge us. We need to engage things that we find both challenging but also meaningful, because in going through those challenges, God shapes us and forms us and can use these things for our betterment. So this morning, maybe there's some way that you personally really need to be more like Bartimaeus. And it may not be physical blindness that you're dealing with, but there's something in your life that you're allowing to hold you back. And maybe this is the day that you need to start being more bold. Maybe it's in something you need to admit. Maybe it's some help that you need to ask for. Maybe this is the day that you just want to boldly step forward and name Jesus as Lord. You've never become a Christian, and today you'd like to do that. But whatever your needs are, any way that we could be a source of encouragement to you, this is a time we've set aside. And if you have a special need, we're happy to talk to you here at the front or after church if you want to catch us in the lobby. Whatever your needs are this morning, this is a time you can come forward as together we stand and sing this song.